Previously on Mom Please. Hey, Mom, how are you today?
Hey, I'm great today. As you all know, Eric and I are mother and son, and we don't always have the same opinions, and we don't always agree. But we always try to have conversations that are respectful and thought-provoking. And with that, today we would like to discuss birth rates. We care about birth rates because a country's population growth, there is the potential there for changing policy decisions concerning health and welfare programs or education or decisions about the economy for each nation. So that's why we care. When I think about it, I sort of think, well, gosh, if there's less people, there's less difficulty with the planet.
Yeah, I would think so.
Right? The climate is better. Infrastructure is better. Overcrowding is better. I don't have to stand in long lines kind of thing.
Right.
But economists don't agree with that. They think there's a significant issue with declining populations. In the U.S., for example, during the 1960s, there were 6 people for every retired person.
Okay.
Today, it's 3 to 1.
Okay, so half.
And by 2035, we expect it to be 2 to 1. So as growth dwindles, we have a smaller population. They buy less goods and services. Who pays for health care? Who pays for, in the U.S., Social Security, Medicare?
Right.
And humankind itself just becomes smaller and older. Economists think that the replacement level rates decline. The population shrinks, grows old. It slows all the economic growth. It strains government budgets.
Yeah.
But not everybody really believes in this doom and gloom kind of thing that the shrinking population is just awful.
Okay.
There's a professor at the University of Vienna who studies this, Eric Stressning, and he thinks that it's really not a problem. He thinks this is more of a theory. Demographer Warren Thompson theorized that in industrialized nations, people gain access, when they gain access to better health care, sanitation like drinking water. When the death rate drops in a population, more children live to adulthood. And under better conditions, families have fewer children. In order to have a stable population, there needs to be a child born for every death.
Yeah, that checks out.
Okay.
That checks out.
Essentially, though, Eric, as we talk about this, the birth rates are declining, but what's causing that decline?
It's interesting. So as we see birth rates declining, we have kind of paid attention to the places where it's been happening. And there are a couple of main factors here that are going on. Worldwide, birth rates declining is attributed to women having more freedom. There's a decline in things such as forced marriages, child marriages. There's also more access to things like contraception, condoms, the pill, IUDs, and such. Increased career and socioeconomic opportunities for women, so women don't have to view their kind of ultimate pinnacle of their being as being a mother and embracing that motherhood. That's not like the ultimate end game for a woman anymore. Women at all economic levels are having fewer children as they gain more control of their reproductive rights. There's also external factors that are kind of like black swan events like COVID-19. The Brookings Institute estimates that there were 300,000 babies that were not born in the United States that would have been born had COVID not happened.
So births among all these groups have declined, and it's, job loss and loss of wealth.
Yeah.
So you could see the impact on families, either having a child or adding to an existing family. It was pretty significant. The economic downturn postpones childbearing. And what they've determined is that once you postpone childbearing, it's unlikely that that child ever gets born. Because as you said earlier, there's no perfect time.
Yeah.
Right? That has an impact on the whole situation. And then maternal support, your extended family, your community, affordable daycare, early childhood care, education, and so forth. All of that has factors that increase fertility. Factors that decrease fertility are wealth and education. It seems like the more wealth, the more educated, the less children in a family.
Yep. It's very hard. So there are a lot of external things that are happening to definitely affect people's decision to have kids. It's even noted by economists and professors and all sorts of people that it is hard to get people to have kids when they just don't think that having kids is in their either their best interest or in their child's best interest.
Right.
Even the richest, savviest, most committed governments, most tenacious governments have struggled to find policies that produce sustained bumps in fertility over time. If there were, he posits that if these things existed, this wouldn't be an issue, and we would have figured them out by now. Right?
And now for the conclusion of the last episode of Mom Please.
So, I can run down kind of a list here of some examples of some things that could qualify as incentives for childbearing.
Sure.
Or
Sure.
things that governments have done to incentivize childbearing. And I'm going to start off with a very controversial and honestly probably terrible example, but it is what in the United States the right is trying to do to increase childbirth is overturning Roe v. Wade.
Okay. I need to talk about that.
Sure.
Okay.
Sure.
So it's interesting to me because, and Eric and I are not doing this on a political nature. We're just saying what is
This is
occurring.
just what's happening. What's happening.
So J.D. Vance, who's the Republican nominee for vice president, is shaming childless women for not having a stake in the country.
Yeah, I've heard this.
And encouraging them to have more children and telling retired women that their sole primary job is to take care of grandchildren.
Yeah.
Now, this is, if you take that and marry it with the overturning of Roe v. Wade, which should create more children,
right,
or more illegal abortion, I'm not really sure.
Probably both.
Probably both. It does sound counterintuitive to the Republican idealism that we should keep government small and not have large programs to support families and daycare and medical care and family leave.
Yeah.
So to me, it sounds counterintuitive. And he was actually quoted as saying, he's also called the falling fertility rate a civilization crisis, and has advocated that people without children should pay higher taxes and have less voting power than people with children.
Yeah.
That's a disincentive, not an incentive.
Yeah, that's a disincentive.
And
it creates a second-class citizenry.
It does. Yeah.
Like that's
a
horrible.
great way to put it.
Did you mention, I'm sorry, did you mention that he was thinking about reducing voting power for childless couples?
Right,
for childless
exactly.
people,
I didn't mention that, but
that's crazy to me, because the last time that I think we had a group of people in this country that had less voting power than another group of people, it was called like the 3/5 rule, and we don't look too fondly upon that anymore.
No,
that's not something that you can introduce.
So anyway, that's like a backdoor incentive to have children.
It's awful.
Okay.
So getting that out of the way.
Yes.
Here's some more positive examples of countries and their governments who have done some things. Hungary, we talked about how they had increased their child rate from 1.2 to 1.5 over the last 15 years. Mm-hmm. They offer a $30,000 loan to newlyweds that is then forgiven if they have 3 kids. So just straight up, 30 grand if you have 3 kids, 10 grand per child.
Okay.
They also have that policy of 25% income tax break per child. So if you get to that 30,000, if you get that loan and you have those 3 kids, you're already plus $30,000 and minus 75% lifetime income tax.
Right. And
every year.
You would think then that people who choose to have the 3 children are offsetting the 1-child families, so their birth rate, their fertility replacement rate should be okay.
You would think so. Yeah. So we'll see.
It'd be interesting to see where that goes.
Where that goes, right? Taiwan has spent billions to create incentives for childbirth, up to similarly like South Korea, direct payments. European countries have started adopting more pro-family policies, significant paid parental leave, publicly supported childcare services. A couple examples of this are Austria grants parental leave up to 2.5 years, which is kind of wild.
Do you still know how to do your job when you go back to it?
If you go back to your job, do you still know the people that you're working with? And in Germany, every child over the age of 1 year old has a right to a spot in a public daycare, which I think that's amazing.
Yeah.
That would be something that I think so many people in this country would
love, right.
would go crazy over.
Right.
In Russia, they offer a one-time lump sum of $7,000 to families that have 2 children or more.
They just have to get out of the war business.
Right. Yeah. Start focusing on something productive and positive. Italy and Greece have been experimenting with baby bonuses on like a per child basis. In Italy, it's a monthly allowance of up to €250 per child. There are also public education campaigns on fertility of varying levels of efficacy and success.
Okay, so Eric, I don't know how that can help because, educated or not, in my case, for instance, lovely Eric, when you were conceived, a diaphragm was being used.
Okay.
Spermicide was being used, and pulling out was being used, and there you were, born 9 months later.
Mom, please, I don't want to hear about this. Although it shows that I'm a fighter. I took all that and I was like, I'm getting through this. This is a puzzle. I just need to figure it out. Wow, that's funny though. So was I an oops baby?
You were never an oops baby. You were always going to happen, just maybe not so soon.
Okay. Well, I'm glad I happened when I did, because I think if I had happened any other time, I wouldn't be the me I am today.
Exactly.
Right?
And
well,
you're
that's
a unicorn.
Great. Yeah. So, yeah. Sure I am. But yeah, like you say, you guys were trying to do everything you could to like not have a kid. There are people out there that don't know about that stuff.
Right. Right.
So they do need to kind of, have some public education campaigns on this. And I'm going to just point out like a couple of them. Like in Denmark, they put up a bunch of posters in 2015 all around Copenhagen, kind of asking women, have you counted your eggs today? Have you?
So is that the your clock is ticking?
I think so. Yeah, it's like, how old are you? Are you 30? Better get on.
You got bad eggs, right? Honey. You better get to it.
Something like that. This next one is absolutely absurd. In 2012, Singapore, the government partnered up with Mentos. Yes, Mentos, the fresh maker, the breath mint, and they made a rap song, hoping to encourage people to participate in National Night and do their civic duty.
So there's a specific night?
Oh yeah, their civic duty to increase that birth rate. And I just so happen to have here the lyrics to said song, and you guys can go search this up. I highly encourage this and recommend you do this, to actually go search the song and find it on YouTube, because it is super, super funny to actually see like what it is.
Like this was a serious campaign.
But like listen to some of these lyrics. Listen to some of this. It starts out like this: "Why you eating a mint, baby? So I can kiss you on the face. Why? Because it's National Night." What? I'm not talking, you see August 9th, it's our time to do our civic duty. And I'm not talking about speeches, fireworks, or parades. But I like that stuff. I'm talking about the stuff after that stuff. I'm talking about making a baby, baby. And it just goes on with the cringiest stuff after this. Like, yeah, it's National Night and I want a baby boo. I know you want it. So does the SDU. So does the Singapore government.
Here you go, Eric. Here you go.
Yeah.
Here you go.
Oh, hey, we got the fresh maker right here. Look at that. Nice. I'll have to pop one of those in later. But yeah, it's so rough. It's National Night, so let's make fireworks ignite. It's National Night, let's make Singapore's birth rate spike. It's like not even subtle about this, Like a government scholar, I want to cram real hard.
I have nothing to say about this.
Tap you all night like an Easy Link card. Like, what is that? Oh, man. So some of these have been better efforts than others. I would have to say.
Okay.
And I think, the best part about that is, by the way, on the if you open up like the extra info on the YouTube page, it has a disclaimer on the bottom of that song that says only financially secure adults in a stable, committed, long-term relationship should participate. So they're like, have babies, but only if you're the right person.
Right. That's
kind of weird.
Oh gosh.
So yeah. So Yeah, that's kind of like some of the things that have happened in these different countries.
Well,
Also, you have like Iran, which has had like crackdowns on contraception, abortion, but
right,
all these like very fundamentalist religious countries are
right,
probably
are
pretty similar
following
in
suit.
that regard. Yeah.
Well, in communist Romania, 1967 and 1990, they attempted to increase their population.
Okay.
So they had a natalist policy were enacted by Nicolae
Ceausescu, I think.
Ceausescu.
Yeah.
And he was their prime minister, essentially.
Mm-hmm.
He outlawed abortion and contraception. Women were routinely given pregnancy tests.
Oof.
Childless couples were taxed heavily.
Yikes.
And there was legal discrimination if you did not have a child. These measures increased the birth rate temporarily,
Sure.
followed by
like
a decline due to illegal abortion.
I mean, it's not surprising that would happen. It's not surprising that would happen.
And the number of Romanian children put in orphanages. And this is funny because these numbers coincide with a neighbor that we had who adopted a kid from Romania.
Oh, no way.
Yeah.
Wow.
And in 1989, that government was overthrown.
Yeah, that's when I was born.
Policies were abandoned.
Okay.
And Ceausescu was eventually executed. So
Okay.
that
clearly went very well.
Yeah, that did not.
That went super
well. And it
well.
went really bad for him.
Yeah.
And then, of course, Communist China from 1978 to 2015, they want to decrease their population. Their current birth rate is 1.16 per woman.
Okay.
The problem that they have is they created the environment where you could only have one kid.
Right.
And so everybody's selected to have the firstborn male.
A male,
right,
yeah.
a male child.
Yeah.
So females were terminated or adopted out.
Right.
Right. And so now there's an imbalance of sex.
And now they're facing a massive population crisis.
Right. And now they have an issue.
Not surprising.
Now they have an issue.
Not surprising.
So, the more and more you look at this stuff, there are factors on birth rates that are outside of the direct control of any kind of government policy.
Right.
They stem from larger social factors that are looming and tend to be the result of unrelated government policy or long-standing cultural values. In the instance of Catholics who are looking away from the church and so forth. They're supposed to procreate and they're not.
So we've kind of gone through a lot of the countries, a lot of different places that are having issues. We've kind of soft talked about why having less people is such a problem.
Right.
But I want to go into a little bit more about what the theories are about this.
Mm-hmm.
And keep in mind, these are theories, and I'm going to talk about some of the reverse theories as well. But mainly the problems are economic. Many people rely on social services and policies that tend to rely on an ever-increasing economy and an ever-increasing population. These can be examples like Medicare, Medicaid, Social Security, and so on and so forth, pensions.
In this country, those are our social programs, but in other countries, they have social programs.
Yeah, they have other things that would
kind.
also suffer, from that. Fewer people working compared to a larger retired population strains the relationship that goes on here because there are less taxpayers to pay in those social systems that those retirees are then using.
Right. Now, I question, is an easy fix to that raising the retirement age?
Yes and no. I think you can raise the retirement age, but it has to coincide not just with economic things going on. It has to coincide with how long we're living. Like you can't just raise the retirement age until, the same age as when people die, right? So the retirement age can go up, but it has to go up in addition to.
Plus, there are obvious professions that you have to retire at a certain time.
Yeah.
Because your senses and you're not as sharp as you used to be.
Right.
I don't want a shaky surgeon.
Yeah, like if you're getting a heart surgery,
that would be bad.
Somebody
that would be bad.
I don't the carotid.
right. I don't want a pilot that really can't read the instrument panel anymore. So forth.
So a shrinking economy also just leads to a lack of young workers available to provide that, like I said, tax base necessary for these current social programs. Also, just a lack of workers in general in things like service industries and care industries. Caring for the elderly is already kind of an issue. There's already like 800,000 older Americans waiting for subsidized care and not getting it because there's a lack of workers.
Right.
So that kind of stuff gets worse. That does get worse. Lack of young people to buy goods and services to propel strong economies. In countries where this happens, this kind of can create a permanent recession due to not creating the proper balance between the increasing GDP and the decreasing population, if there is even an increasing GDP. You get declines in basic services and infrastructure. There's less demand for basic services due to the employment drop because of the falling tax base. This leads to less tax money being able to put, the government can't put towards things like police forces, firefighters, electricity.
Right.
Governments have to abandon things like public transportation, bus, rail services. They have to combine school districts to keep up economies of scale.
Right.
Hospitals and townships get, bundled together. So in order to maintain the same level of economy, you have to necessarily kind of get these larger groups of people together. We're creating a larger dependency ratio, which means the ratio of those in the workforce to those who are not in the workforce.
Right.
Like you were saying,
we already said it's 3
amount
to
of
1
retired
now,
people, right?
And it's going
gonna
to
be
2 to
1
1
in the future.
Right.
So that creates that potential crisis in end of care, end of life care that I mentioned earlier. You can kind of probably say goodbye to like Medicare, Medicaid, Social Security, pensions, so on and so forth. There would be fewer young people to serve in the military, fewer young people who had the time and the finances available to them to innovate and create new and interesting technologies and things.
But I'm thinking about if we could open our imaginations and think about people who could be completely dedicated to innovation that could be carried out in the future by AI.
Hopefully with some automation help.
Right?
Yeah, that
So
does,
maybe that won't be, although, I question that because if you've ever seen A Space Odyssey 2001, where Hal, the supercomputer 9000, just completely blows up and goes nuts.
Yeah, what is he like?
He's singing,
I'm sorry, Kevin, Dave. I can't do that. Right?
right. So, our reliance on that, I don't know. But
Right. So maybe that's not as huge of an issue as our technological capability increases.
Right.
However, there also can be issues with services like mental health industries, which we're seeing kind of mental health crises pop up all over the place and not as many social workers and psychologists in that environment to care for them. You have issues like deflation, which can be seen in Japan and their issues with their economy.
Right.
Unemployment rate rises, which is kind of similar to the dependency ratio. And that's kind of all the bad things it means. And basically, these all this information that I just said to you, this is coming from economists, business leaders, and the government.
Right.
And I'm not going to exactly say why it's important to think about that right now, but I will circle back around to that. But keep that in mind. Who's telling us this? Now, can we even survive in a less consumer-focused society? There's a lot of research out there that says yes.
Okay.
There's a lot of research out there that suggests...
I'm glad to hear it.
That it is possible. Now, with that said, we have to think of a few things. With larger groups of people, capitalism is the best indicator of quality of life in a country. So if there's a strong capitalist component to a country, that country generally has a high standard of living because there hasn't been any other government or economic system that has been able to scale up in the way that capitalism has and provide as much increase in quality of life.
Right.
I would love to say, let's look at communism and try to do that. But communism is not viable and it's not really an alternative to capitalism at scale because communism relies on everybody feeling like they're relatively equal to each other and nobody coveting status and coveting power. And we have people in the world that definitely covet status and power. And I don't think you can get rid of all those people. I think there will necessarily always be somebody coveting status or power.
And, clearly...
You always have like a Putin around.
Right. And clearly, I was just going to say, clearly in the communist environments,
yes,
that, the countries that consider themselves communist now, they're really socialist.
They're not that communist anymore.
What's really happening in those countries is there's a very wealthy class.
Right.
And the poor.
And everybody else. Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
And so I just I don't think that structure
I don't think that
works
structure
for
can work.
this decline in population.
However, something that's very interesting to see is what ended up happening with a lot of the countries once the Soviet Union and that form of communism went away. All those Soviet bloc nations and all the former like Soviet like allies went through significant population declines. And this has been studied. This has been looked at by a lot of different people. And they were like, are all of these countries now failing because they have lost all their population or a significant amount of their population? And the answer is no.
Okay.
You know, you have many, many countries that are doing, you know, fine in the wake of all this. So if we're looking at if we're looking at long-term kind of ideas, there have been, there's not, it hasn't always been, you asked this earlier, when did we start thinking the increasing population is a good thing? Like an ever-increasing population is a good thing. So for a really long time, most people, most theorists, most economists, most philosophers, people who thought about this stuff, thought that an increasing population wasn't a good thing. You know, from as far back as Plato in the 4th century BC to the early 1500s when Thomas More's Utopia was published, all the way to Thomas Malthus's essay on the principle of population in 1803, population control, aka avoiding overpopulation, was believed to be the correct approach to how to deal with humanity and its increasing, you know, growth as a species. So this guy Thomas Malthus specifically, and he's an economist from way back in the day, he specifically believed that the human population was growing at a rate that was greater than the food production could keep up with, which would eventually lead to famine, disease, war, and general calamity. And I don't know if you've looked at the world today, but there's kind of a lot of famine, disease, war, and general calamity going on. So that guy might have been onto something. Only more recently was that kind of thought process challenged. In 1938, American economist, again, economist, Alvin Hansen expressed his fears that in his presidential address to the American Economic Association that year, that the declining population growth would result in fewer additional outlets for investment. Like outlets for investment would close. And that basically means that fewer people, less money. It's about as complex as that gets. Now, just a bit earlier, just a year earlier in 1937, John Maynard Keynes, you know, everybody knows for Keynesian economics, that big popular concept, he was arguing for a stabilized population. And he believed that if there were no major wars and no major increases in population, that problems with economics, things like recession, depression, inflation, all this would be solved within 100 years. And, you know, we sit here in 2024, which is almost 100 years from this theory, and we have gone the opposite direction with our population. At that time, there might have been like 3 billion people in the world when he lived, and now there's like 8 billion. So clearly, we didn't follow what he said to do. And we still deal with recession, depression, inflation. Interesting. So there was a reaction to that thought that came from an Australian political economist by the name of Joseph Schumpeter. And he argued in his book in 1942, Capitalism, Socialism, and Democracy, that population aging and population decline don't necessarily need to restrict output from either the demand side or the supply side of economic theory, which basically is like entirely opposite what people are saying nowadays, that it's going to affect the supply and demand. Now, interestingly enough, during the population boom of your era of the 1950s and 1960s, when the baby boomers came along, economists actually began to question how bad this increase in population, how we're going to manage this. You know, that it might impede the GDP and the GDP per capita. You know, individual people are going to get poorer even if the GDP looks better because there's so many more people. So, you know, that happened in a couple of papers or a couple of publications by Simon Kuznets in 1967. And this is interesting. This is a biologist, Paul Ehrlich's The Population Bomb in 1968. So a biologist was looking into this, not just economics, or economists.
Oh, and I think social scientists are
social
studying
sciences,
this. Sure.
So now in the current day, populations around the world are in decline. Notably, In the States, not really, a little bit, kind of, but mostly in like Europe and Southeast Asia. And these declining rates of growth do lead to an aging population, like in Italy, where you have the average age of people at 47.9. Now, there are some countries which are experiencing stable or declining populations. And after 1990, as I said, it's a lot of these Soviet bloc nations who were broken free of the grip of Soviet communism. So if we look at these, if we look at some of these different places, you have basically like Romania, Bulgaria, let's see, who else? Bosnia, Herzegovina, Belarus, Croatia, Estonia, Georgia, Hungary, Italy, Japan, Latvia, Lithuania, Moldova, Portugal, Romania, Russia, Serbia, and Ukraine. These are the nations that this particular study took a look at, and these nations have had declining populations basically since 1990. And they kind of looked at all of these things, and there have been instances of these declining populations experiencing positive GDP increases, GDP per capita increases, and various papers. So we have Elgin and Tuman from 2012, Jones from 2022, Strulik from 2022, Sakasi and Hoshida from 2017. So these are clearly people from different parts of the world. Human capital is the major influencing factor in being able to survive with a declining population, but also an increasing GDP.
Right.
You have to invest in people and get the people, individual people, to be a little bit more productive.
Right.
But that is possible. This is not something that hasn't happened before.
Right. Can I'd like to speak to that a little bit, because that, we used to, being in human resources when I worked, we referred to initially, everything was personnel.
Yes.
And then we went to human resources,
yes,
considering people as a resource to the company. And then at some point, the economic concept of human capital came along. And it's not something that you measure necessarily on your return on investment. However, the concept, it's a solution to this.
Yes.
By going from a labor-oriented economy to a human capital economy. So human capital itself is determining the economic value of every employee within your organization.
Right.
It's based on your education, your training, your intelligence, your skills, your health, your reliability, all of these factors. And it's not a balance sheet item per se, but as organizations invest in the human person, the human capital itself, you can increase that person's productivity with a shrinking population.
Correct.
And if you can get good human resources people, they can actually produce an ROI for you on human capital. Yep. So it can be done. It can be done.
It can absolutely be done. And also, in addition to that, not just the human capital aspect of it, but a decline in population can actually increase the labor participation rate if that decline is accompanied by an increase in wages per laborer, which it reasonably should, because you have less supply on the labor side, and so there should be more demand for it.
Right.
So if people are getting paid more money, they'll want to work more. Shocker.
Right.
Who would have thought that?
Right. Now, there will be perhaps fewer goods and services available.
Sure.
Or the ones that were not economically as viable will go away.
Right. So, things like, well, here, let me say this. You have all these different things that can factor into what happens when you have a lowered population or a declining population. Mm-hmm. And the only thing I think the reason, I'm going to roll back around to why it's business leaders and why it's economists and why it's politicians that are telling you that this is a problem. And it's because if I'm thinking about it from the perspective of, I'm a Netflix CEO or I'm a Netflix major shareholder, I own like 25% of Netflix stock out there. If there's less people in the world, that means there's less people subscribing to Netflix. Less subscribers means less money for me. So I want to make sure, if I am at the top of that structure, I want to maintain or increase the amount of people subscribing to my services all the time so I can get more and more and more money. Mm-hmm. And not only that, but in our capitalist system, in the way that we have it set up here in America, CEOs have a fiduciary responsibility to their shareholders to essentially constantly increase the production and constantly increase the stock price of their company.
Right.
So those are obviously competing interests to what is actually maybe a better way forward of shrinking the population and making sure that everybody is just a little bit more productive.
Right.
You know, I think, you know, I don't want to get too conspiracy theorist about this, but I think that that's kind of the push and pull here, is that big business doesn't really have a very high interest in the human capital argument of it. They don't really care. As long as they have people who they can plug into positions and they can do the job that they need to do, that's all they really want.
Mm-hmm.
So, you know, that's kind of what's going on there. Or at least that's part of what I think is going on there.
Okay.
Yeah, so at the end of the day, and I think this is interesting because this speaks to why that relationship exists. The results of this data show that a reduction in the population, it does reduce the GDP, but that reduction is less than the effect that an increase in population has on the increase in GDP. So
that's interesting.
From a big business person's perspective,
Right.
an increase is more valuable to you because there's a larger correlative relationship there. Now, both of these are like really, really small. They're like percents, individual
Right, small
percents that are
percents,
happening.
right.
But to a big business person, every tiny little dollar matters. Now, other things, changes in economy based on population, specifically based on
Right.
population, it lags behind the population change by a number of years. At least 5
Oh,
is what the
okay.
study has proven. So in the short term, population changes don't significantly affect the economy. In that 5-year span, that population change doesn't actually affect the economy immediately. The effects of labor participation on the long-term scale do affect per capita GDP and overall GDP, as well as unemployment rate and labor participation rate. So if there are more people working in the economy, that has the largest effect. If the relative ratio of people working in the economy to people not working, if that's bigger, that's where the biggest effect is on the GDP. So as our population shrinks, it will get older now and there will be less people working, but that balances out eventually. And if it results in more people ending up working, which it should eventually,
Right.
that's the way to increase the GDP.
Right.
Get more people working.
Right. So in other words, a greater amount of the population itself needs to be productive and
Yes.
out there.
Yes.
Right. Okay. That makes sense to me. Well, I think human capital, I would love to see more investment in that.
I would too.
And to make sure that
I would too.
My concern is that not everybody actually wants to be productive.
Sure.
I mean, there's
You don't need everybody
there's
to be
that,
productive.
you know.
Just a good number of people.
Right, right. And, you know, I'm a firm believer in adapting
Yes.
and listening and really looking at our environment in a way that we study it, we listen, and we learn, and we adjust.
Yeah.
And a stupid old example I'll give you is there was a movie in 1960 called The Time Machine, where it was based on...
I read that book. I like that.
It's based on H.G. Wells, and he is a man from the 1900s who creates a time machine.
Right.
And he goes forward like 3 times. Eventually, he gets to the year 800,000.
Yeah, like
so
8
way,
gajillion.
right.
Right.
And he finds this civilization with 2 kinds of people, the Eloi and the Morlocks.
Yep.
And the Eloi live above ground, and they're childlike. They can't read. They can't write. And they show him a library with all crumbled books. And he finds out that the Morlocks are more sophisticated. They stay underground all the time, and they are essentially breeding the Eloi for food.
Yeah, food production.
Ew.
Yikes.
Ew.
Cannibalism. Yikes.
And he returns to his year of 1900, and he grabs 3 what he considers to be important books, which they never reveal in the movie what they are.
Okay.
Some speculate it's the Bible. Some speculate it's the U.S. Constitution. Some say it's maybe the greatest novel ever made that shows strife and rising above it.
Sure.
I don't know, maybe
Maybe the Epic of Gilgamesh.
right,
Yeah.
or Charles Dickens,
Yeah,
whatever. And he brings it back to the future, those 3 books, and he decides to stay there with the Eloi and teach them and move them forward and advance them. And to me, that movie is all about hope.
Yeah.
And in
yeah.
all of this, I can't give up hope. I think that we have bright people in this world who are obviously looking at this and have been looking at it for a long time, since the 1930s and forward. They've been looking at this. And I think we will get to a point where we will have a good understanding. The issue is, I wonder about our own cooperation in this.
Yeah, well,
right? Because we are consumption oriented.
That's true.
And
that's true. We like our things.
Right. We have effectively driven mom and pops out of business. Brick and mortar stores are, very, very scarce resources on their shelves, right?
And they're expensive too. It's
and
like more expensive than online.
when we've gotten into a little bit of a crisis, like when COVID started happening, we hoarded the toilet paper like no other.
Yeah.
Right. So,
what a time.
In my household, if I don't get a visit from Amazon almost every day, I'm a little sad. I'm just saying.
Depressed.
Yeah. An experiment that Eric and I have been talking about is, if there are less resources available, if there are less things available to you, what's something that you could learn to live without?
What I could give up.
Right. We're thinking about doing this for 30 days and kind of reporting back.
Yeah.
So, do you want me to go first? I'll tell you what I thought.
Go ahead.
Okay.
What is yours?
So I like to drink a certain amount of water every day, right?
Okay.
And I'm so lazy about this that I know in a plastic bottle of water that I buy how many ounces it is. And I know how many of those I like to drink per day.
Okay.
So I am a consumer of that plastic bottle with water in it. So I am vowing not to use the Yeti and to fill it up myself.
Or your Stanley.
Or my Stanley, and use that instead of purchasing bottled water.
I think that's really good.
So I'm going to try that.
I think plastics are pretty awful in the world. So me and my wife, this is something that I don't really talk about a lot because I personally think it's a pretty gross, awful habit, and I've been trying to handle it for a while. But we're both smokers, so our goal, both of us together, me and my wife, we are giving up nicotine at the end of this month in all forms of all kinds. And that starts on August 31.
Okay, they're going to be
10 days. Well, 9 days now. 9 days now. Yeah, we're going to have a absolutely wonderfully miserable week together.
That's not Labor Day weekend, right? It's
no,
the weekend
I don't
before.
think so. I think it's the weekend before.
Yeah, you'll be cranky. You'll be
a
cranky.
little bit.
Call me if you need a little, pep talk.
Yeah.
Okay, that's great. I mean, that's, one of the things that I think we have to think about as humans.
Definitely.
Is putting something aside that you think you can do, something viable, right? Because it may come to pass, right? It may come to pass.
We may all have to learn how to be less consumeristic in the future.
And then the other thing we wanted to talk about in birth rates is that idea of intentional planning a family.
Yes.
And your life priorities. And to discuss that, Eric and I are now unveiling a new segment in our podcast that's called Let's Get Personal.
Yes.
And the idea here is for you to get to know Eric and I a little better as human beings. And so today we're going to discuss our thoughts on family and having children.
All right.
And how they may differ from each other.
Well, let's get personal
perhaps.
then.
So let's get personal, Eric.
All right. So I'm not having kids.
Right.
Me and my wife we're 35 now, and we have for a long time, we have discussed this. Mm-hmm. And I think I was personally on the fence about it. I felt like I could see myself having kids or not. She has very strong opinions on not having children. Mm-hmm. And over the years, I think, I've come around to understanding her perspective a lot more, because I think I see it a lot in the same way. So a lot of people, they don't look very favorably on people who choose not to have children for one reason or another. So I would like to kind of take the time to explain that decision-making process a little bit. So the first thing is, kids are expensive. Kids, I think, cost somewhere in the realm of $250,000 US.
And that's just to raise them. That's not to educate them beyond that. That's probably another 200,000.
That's like 0 to 18.
Right.
So if you're going to send them to college is very expensive nowadays. So that could be potentially another $250,000. So you're looking at like $500K potentially per kid that you have just purely dedicated to that child. And that's financial. That's not even talking about time investment that you have to make with that child, because it is a massive, massive time investment. You cannot ignore, spending the time with your child. Personally, I don't think I'm really responsible enough. When I think about the amount of things that I would have to give up, the amount of things in my life that I would have to curtail or kind of put a hold on, there's that idea that sometimes having kids I wouldn't say makes you give up your dreams, but I would say some people certainly feel that they didn't get to explore all the things that they wanted to do with their lives before they had their children. I think with myself and my wife, there is a large possibility of passing on very bad genetics to our children. And that's not from me mostly, although I do have my issues. Like, we suffer from chronic migraine. You and I, for example, so I could pass that on to a kid. Now, she doesn't want to pass on things like mental health issues, BPD, schizophrenia, narcissism, dementia, ADHD, all these things run in her family. Autoimmune deficiency, joint issues like arthritis. She's got a sleep disorder. I think that she really doesn't have a strong feeling about potentially her child dealing with these same things. And I wouldn't want our child to deal with some of these things. And not just that, but like, I'm going to get really real for a second here. And I think, I really hope I don't offend anybody with this statement, but this is just how I feel about it. If I had a special needs child, I don't know what I'd do. I look at parents of special needs children and I think, my God, those people must be like the most mentally tough people in the entire world to be able to handle something like that. And I don't think I could. I don't think I have it within me as I am today to handle that. So that's something. We just talked about all the issues going on kind of with the current world and like, so there's like economic issues, environmental issues, political instability, school safety issues. I've heard that they're going to allow like teachers to have guns in school now to combat school shootings. That's insanity to me. I don't want my child in that environment. There's not enough social programs in the US for children, I don't think. Like, when did feeding children lunch at school become such a fucking issue? I don't know. And excuse my language, but that's how I feel about it. Like, give the kid a cheese sandwich for God's sake or something, so, I honestly think the future, it looks worse for generations ahead of me than my generation. I don't like that. I think for a longest time up until kind of my generation, the future always looked better for the people who were coming into it. So there's that. And I got one really, really easy, simple reason. My wife doesn't want to have kids. I firmly believe in the concept of bodily autonomy. If she doesn't want to have kids, that makes that decision for me, period. I respect her choice.
Right. Yeah.
So that's kind of
where you're at.
The rundown of kind of the quick list of things. I have some other things about it, but I'm curious. You had 3 children, one of them being me.
I have
three beautiful
3 children
right over here. What were your reasons for having kids?
And I want to walk you through my journey.
Sure.
Okay. So as a young woman, I was pretty ambivalent about having children, right?
Yeah.
I never imagined or longed to be a mother. As you know, I was career oriented. I liked my work. When I was a young girl, little girl, I didn't play with baby dolls as much as I played with Barbie, who was a career girl.
Right.
And then I met your father and we fell in love. And I just began to imagine sharing a family with him. And he wanted a family.
Yeah.
And so then when we did get married, it became something that I really wanted to. And And if we couldn't have had our own kids, we probably would have found our way.
Sure,
have
adopted
children,
or something
adopt or
like
whatever.
that. Maybe one of those Romanian
Right,
children.
Right. And then 7 years later, we find ourselves having 3 wonderful little people in our lives, right? And
I'd like to think I was wonderful.
Right. And arguably, I think as a mother, and I can only speak to this because I am female, the act of creating life might be a little bit more significant because it's profound, because the very moment that you start feeling the baby, it's with you.
Yeah.
You know that you've created something, right? It's very real. And I didn't really even love pregnancy all that much. But
I don't think any woman does.
Yeah. No, I think a lot of women like it.
Really?
And the day I met each one of my children, I have to say, outside of my womb, my little Grinchy heart grew significantly.
Oh, that's nice.
Right?
Yeah.
I remember holding each one of you in my arms for the very first time, and I felt you feel this overwhelming feeling of unconditional love. Now, contemplating having a kid, I didn't know that would happen, right?
Right.
But I felt it immediately, and I felt the hope for their future, not for my future, for their future.
Yeah.
So my priority shift, as you're saying, it changes. And I look at a kid, a baby, and I look at Remy like this right now. That's my granddaughter. That a child is so innocent and perfect.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
And you have this undeniable sense of joy about that this kid could change the world, maybe. You don't know.
Yeah, maybe. Maybe.
And there's that you need to protect that child.
Yeah.
So it is just an overwhelming feeling that I have never had in any other circumstances before. Birth is clearly a miracle. There's no question about it in my mind. And I felt, and as I do today, privileged and honored to be a mother. And I probably learned more about life and nurturing and acting selflessly from being a mother, from being a parent.
Yeah.
But with that caveat, I will say at the time that I'm having children, there's heavy, big inflation. The job market is changing significantly.
Oh, yeah.
Right?
And rapidly.
But economically, I know all the time that I can afford to have 3 children and raise them in a way that will make me feel good about it.
Yeah.
Launching them into the world with all of the benefit and opportunity that they possibly could have. Okay?
Yeah.
So that's different. Now, I will say this, that people who do not feel that they will be enriched by having a family, you can't envision putting yourself second, putting the needs of another ahead of you at all times. Don't have kids.
Yeah, I agree.
Don't have kids.
I completely agree.
If the weight of the world, of what's happening in the world, is so overwhelming to you that you can't imagine bringing a child into it, don't do it. And I can't argue against that. I say you do you. And for all those future grandmas that I know and all the ones that are in the world, that are yearning to have a grandbaby and their kids are not feeling it.
Yeah.
Take a back seat. Don't do it.
Yeah.
Just don't do it.
Yeah. I think that a lot of grandmas or a lot of hopeful grandmas might be mad at you,
right?
But I think that's very sage advice. And you know what, Mom? You said something really nice. I feel privileged and, very fortunate to have you as my mother. I probably haven't said that all the time in my life. But
no, you haven't.
I think, looking back on it, I appreciate everything that happened in my childhood.
You know what? And we've been through a lot together.
Yeah.
Right.
Oh yeah.
And, you make mistakes along the way because no one is perfect.
Yeah.
And you try your very, very best. But as I said before, about the Eloys, I'm hopeful.
Yeah.
I was always hopeful. And again, if people don't feel hopeful about it, or you can't afford to do it economically,
right.
or your circumstances are such that I understand how you can't do it.
Yeah.
I understand.
Yeah.
So.
Well, I think that about wraps us up for here today.
It does.
We appreciate everybody joining us, and we hope that you guys enjoyed the wonderful conversation between me and my mom today.
Okay.
We are pretty much everywhere. We are on Apple Podcasts. We're on Spotify. We got our main YouTube channel. We're on iHeartRadio. All, like, every place that you find podcasts, you can find us. We will be back next month with another episode. And we're kind of flipping around with what topics we're going to choose. So we're going to keep you guys in the dark on what we're going to do, surprise you a little bit. But yeah, I think that's it for us here today.
Okay, go home.
Go home.
Eat the Mentos.
Eat some Mentos.
Eat the Mentos.
Also, don't forget, mind the generation gap and keep it civil, everyone. Cheers.
Cheers.